Mel and Will were driving their son Mark to State University, where he was about to begin his freshman year. It was more than a 4-hour drive from their home, and they had rented a van to carry all of the things Mark thought he needed. At 18, Mark had been living at home for all these years, though the family dynamic had been strained ever since his mother's infidelity. Mark's older sister, Sherry, had already left for college the week before, starting her junior year at a small liberal arts school. She had her own car and shared an apartment, and while she would return home during vacations, she had been absent during most of the summers, working in Pennsylvania. As a result, she hadn't played much of a role in helping Mark cope with the ongoing family tension. Throughout Mark's junior year of high school, the atmosphere at home remained tense. His father lived in the basement apartment for a long time, and the two parents were practically dead to each other. Neither seemed willing to communicate with the other. Mark had eventually grown accustomed to the cold silence between them. Then, things started to improve. His parents had started to reconnect. They were having sex again. His father moved back into the master bedroom, and dinners became less stressful. For a while, things seemed to get back to a somewhat normal routine. But that didn't last. By the time Mark had graduated high school, the atmosphere at home had begun to deteriorate again. Although his parents were still technically together, they had no real interest in each other anymore. The lightheartedness and affection had faded, and a forced cheerfulness hung in the air. The drive to the university, which had started with some light conversation, was now filled with long stretches of silence. Mark tolerated it as best as he could. When they finally arrived at the dormitory, Will helped carry Mark's heavy suitcases inside. As they attempted to arrange furniture and decide on closet options, the process became a bit more enjoyable. They eventually settled on the best setup and met Mark's roommate Brian and his family. Brian was everything Mark wasn't, a tall, blonde, and charming guy who seemed to have a natural ease about him. His parents fit that description perfectly as well. Mark, by contrast, was a more average guy. But despite their differences, the two roommates clicked immediately. Both were computer enthusiasts, and their shared interests laid the foundation for what seemed to be the beginning of a great friendship. Mark declined his parents' offer to have an early dinner with them. They had a hotel room near the campus, and there was a nice restaurant nearby. But Mark couldn't bear the thought of idle conversation. He stayed in the dormitory, waving goodbye to them. While he felt a pang of sadness, there was also a sense of relief. He was determined to make the most of his upcoming year. Mel and Will went to the restaurant for dinner. It was a decent place, and the food was excellent. But Will was almost paralyzed by the emptiness he felt now that the nest was empty. As a stay-at-home parent, he had grown accustomed to the presence of their children. Still, the meal was enjoyable, and both Mel and Will ate, though they didn't talk much. They ended up skipping dessert. After returning to their hotel room and unpacking, they each took a shower. Will was first, sitting in just his underwear when Mel came over to him and sat on his lap, completely naked. She smiled at him and said, "I want to have some fun. Take my mind off all this." Will chuckled, "That's what we do best," and they made love twice, with a 40-minute break in between. The next morning, they woke up and began their drive back home. The ride was mostly quiet, with little conversation. As they pulled onto the county road, Mel asked, "Is that it?" Will nodded and responded, "We just don't know if everything will ever be all right. We can wait until Christmas to tell them." Mel said, "You killed Robert." Will smiled but didn't respond. He smiled every time he thought about it. After a while, Mel spoke again. "It took me a while to realize you could have done it, even though you said you wouldn't. Even though I knew you could do it and walk away. That's what I told the guy." She burst into tears. Will didn't comment on the accuracy of her supposed insight. He simply said, "I've found that most people have a hard time believing in evil." Mel gasped, "You're not evil, Will." "I know," he replied calmly. "I'm sure you've given this question some serious thought. But if it was as you suggest, why would I have done it if I wasn't just being mean?" At that moment, he stopped the car in the driveway. Without saying another word, They got out and carried their belongings into the house. Will made sandwiches for lunch, and they ate together in the kitchen. Afterward, they went their separate ways, each working from home. Will had converted the basement apartment into an office where he could get away from Mel. For dinner, Will made pizza and salad. It was delicious, and Mel commented, "Damn, I'll never find anyone to cook for me like you do." Will grinned. "Well, I like to cook. Maybe I'll write a cookbook. I'll give you a copy, and you can cook for yourself." He paused before adding, "Actually, I'll sell you a copy. Maybe it'll be a Christmas present." That night, they went to bed in the king-size bed, but they didn't touch each other. The next morning at breakfast, Mel chewed her food slowly, then gasped. "To try to save the marriage. You did it to try and save the marriage." She stared at Will, waiting for a response. "Well," he said after a moment, "if I did, and if that was the reason, it didn't work out in the end," she continued. "If he was alive anywhere, you would never have been able to relax with me. So you did to him what you promised." Will replied, "I said that to try and stop you. It was a weak attempt. I feel guilty about it. I could have done more." She looked at him intently. "I could have come to Pittsburgh and confronted him." "What would you have done then?" Will shrugged. "I'm not sure, to be honest. If I'd barged in and you left with him, he'd never have made it to the door. You'd be raising the kids on your own." She was quiet for a moment. "So you didn't go. Have you thought about that?" Will looked at her and said, "I think our marriage was fundamentally altered the first time you hooked up with that guy. Even if you had come home and not slept with him, even if I had gotten over it, our love was tainted by slow poison." After a long pause, she said, "It's like the Greek tragedies." He nodded, then asked, "Are you going to fight the divorce?" "No," she replied. "Once I started believing you killed him, I tried. But it made you angry. It didn't seem—" "It made me scared," he interrupted. "Every time I thought about it, a chill ran through me. It was insidious and cruel. What if you got mad at me and we gradually drifted apart? No longer friends." "I tried," she said softly. "In the end, it didn't matter. Dead or alive, he'll always be the highlight of your life as a woman. It was eating away at me. And the fact that you could do that to us all for sex." Her voice trailed off, and she wiped her eyes. "Well, here we are. You'll be served at work tomorrow." She cried quietly, but he didn't cry. Robert had completely forgotten about Mel as he walked on Sunday evening from his favorite restaurant toward his apartment. The cold wind blew through the streets, but he decided to walk anyway. He liked trudging through the trees and shrubbery. He especially enjoyed walking in the dark because it kept him alert. After all, anything could happen, and oh, wonder it did. He felt a hand on his neck, and then nothing. Will saw that Robert was indeed heading toward his little hiding place on the path. It had taken him a while to scout out this location. He saw Robert walking past him. Will, dressed in black camouflage, held a syringe at the ready. When Robert was 10 feet away, Will slipped out onto the path, looked both ways, and then straddled Robert's neck, quickly injecting the syringe into his muscle. Robert squirmed for only a few seconds before collapsing. Will dragged him off the path, placing him into a black body bag. Picking up the bundle, he headed down the low hill to the service road of the small glass factory. There was no one nearby. Will shoved Robert into the back seat of the pickup and covered him with a tarp. He got into the driver's seat and drove quietly south. 90 minutes later, Will pulled off a dirt road in a county in southern Pennsylvania. He reached his destination by back roads. The place had been thoroughly scouted. 50 yards off the road was an abandoned mine. Will carried his bundle to the entrance and stepped inside. He secured the wooden barrier and turned on the lantern. He unzipped the body bag and aimed a light at Robert's face. Will splashed some water on Robert's face. Robert opened his eyes, feeling unwell and very sick from the bright light. He thought he might be in a hospital, but then the light dimmed slightly, and Robert saw a man wearing a mask. "I have money," Robert tried to say, but Will didn't understand it. Robert slowly regained consciousness. His hands were tied behind his back, rendering him unable to move. Will had little time left. He waited as Robert twitched slightly, but he couldn't break free. "What do you want?" "I have money," Robert said, his voice weak. Will could understand him now. He pulled off his mask and replied, "All this will eventually go to the state." "It's a shame, really, so much effort." Robert looked at him intently and recognized him. "Mel's toady," he muttered, wrinkling his nose. Will saw panic spread across Robert's face. Sickening terror. Will smiled at him. "She warned you. Said I'd kill you if you slept with her. You're a dumbass." Robert, trying to remain defiant, shot back, "You won't get away with this. I'm a big shot. People will be looking for me." Will smiled unfazed. "This mine is 75 feet deep. They won't find you. You have no family. No one cares. Tell me, was she worth it?" "No," Robert replied, finally sounding remorseful. "I'm sorry." "I know," Will said, "but it's time to die." Robert shouted in protest, but Will quickly flipped him over onto his back and slit his throat with a large knife. As Robert choked and gasped, Will pushed him over the edge into the shaft. The sound of thumps echoed, followed by a distant splash. Then silence. Will discarded the knife and gloves, tossing them down the shaft. He covered the hole with plywood, sealed the mine entrance, and locked it shut. Then he walked back to his truck and drove away. It took Will an hour to reach his cabin. He washed his clothes and went to bed. As the divorce neared its finalization, Will reflected on Mel's words about why he had killed Robert. To try to save their marriage by removing the threat. To let her think what she thought. Perhaps it had even been a gesture of love for her. But Will knew the real reason for his actions. And that reason made him smile every time he remembered that night with Robert.